Well, to start the second day of the 10th Seminar of Protection of Privacy and Data Protection, CGI.br, we have the great honor of presenting our keynote today, which is Professor Dennis Hertz, a law professor and from Ohio State University, Moritz College of Law. And he's also a law professor at the Capital University Law School. And the topic, which is quite interesting and pertinent, that is going to be approached by Professor Dennis, talks about the paradigm of controlling personal data. Today, in the moment that we are, just a few moments before the data protection law is passed in Brazil, there is a need to conceptually understand and even to have the purpose, the guidelines about the principles of law, what we expect from a compliance program and what citizens are going to be able to expect in terms of rights and benefits coming from this law. So the control paradigm is very important because in one perspective, it may seem at first sight and in preliminary analysis that data protection, inheriting the legacy of protection to privacy, would enable citizens to control or to have control over their data. But a dilemma that Professor Hirsch is going to approach is how today, in view of a massive data handling, the complexity of data analytics, and effects that sometimes are unpredictable, how can we have reasonable control over our rights? That would demand almost supernatural knowledge of people about how their data is handled. So before I go into the topic, it's Professor Hertz that is going to talk about it. I would like to thank him and give you the floor. Thank you, Professor.
Good morning, everybody. What a privilege it is to be here with you, to be at this very interesting conference, to meet so many interesting people, and to be here at such a significant time in data protection law in Brazil with the recent passage of your new data protection statute. Congratulations on that. That's a major accomplishment. I'm sure there are people in this room who were helped to make that possible, and so it's really it's a great privilege to be here, especially at this time. I want to thank the people from NIC.br who have made my trip so easy and comfortable and taken care of me so well, especially Caroline and Karen. Appreciate that. And special thanks to Bruno Bioni, who engineered this invitation to bring me here. We tried once before, and obstacles got in our way, and this time we did it. I'm here. We did it, Bruno. All right. So I'm going to talk to you about data analytics. I call it big data analytics. Sometimes it's predictive analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning. These technologies really overlap considerably. And what the increasing use of these technologies, especially in the economy, and I'm going to focus on the economy. I'm not focusing on government use of data. I'm focusing on commercial use of data. What the increasing use of these technologies in the economy means for privacy law and data protection law. And I want to start with a short example, a story about a credit card company that was trying to find the right people to whom it could market its cards. So who are the right people? The right people are people who will pay off their credit card loans, people who are a good credit risk, who are a low risk of defaulting on their cards. So how do they find these people? Well, they have a massive set of data, which is their past history with their customers. And they know who paid their credit card bills and who defaulted. And they know what these people purchased with their cards, right? So they take this massive data and they look for a pattern. What purchases do people make who pay off their cards that people who default don't make? Because if you can find that correlation, the purchases that correlate to being a good credit risk, paying off your card, then you can use that to find other people who will be a good credit risk, people who share the same attribute, make the same types of purchases, but are not yet your customer. So they looked at their massive set of consumer purchases and tried to find the purchase that had the closest correlation to paying off your credit card and not defaulting. And the purchase that they found that most closely correlated with this was furniture anti-scuff pads, the little pads that you put on the bottom of your furniture. Now, why people who buy furniture anti-scuff pads are a good credit risk and pay off their credit cards, I don't know. You know, maybe it's that they're extra responsible, you know, and do it. I have to say, I never got furniture anti-scuff pads until I got married, and my wife puts them on our furniture, so that's good. But maybe that's the reason. Maybe people who buy furniture anti-scuff pads have more valuable floors that they want to protect, and so they're wealthier. You know, we can think of a number of reasons, but the key thing here is they didn't need to know the reason. All they needed to know was the correlation. And once they found this, they could go out and look for people who purchase furniture anti-scuff pads. They can get that data from other companies, other data brokers who can give them that information. And they could market their credit cards to these people, and that's what they did. Now, I tell you this story not so you can run out and buy furniture anti-scuff pads. I tell it to you because it illustrates what is happening with data analytics, that what they were doing was big data analytics. And I want to talk today about big data analytics, the risks that it poses to individuals as it is used in the economy. I want to explain why, in my view, traditional data protection and privacy laws do not protect people from these risks. And I want to talk about some of the new regulatory paradigms that are emerging to address these risks in the algorithmic economy. And finally, I'd like to say a few words about the Brazilian data protection law and some provisions in that law that I think have good potential in this area to be helpful. So first of all, what is big data analytics? Well, it starts with a massive data set, and the analyst looks for a correlation, right, between two attributes. So in the credit card example, they were looking for a correlation between paying off your credit card and some type of purchase. They didn't know what purchase. They had to find that from the data, or as they say, let the data speak. It turned out to be furniture anti-scuff pads. Once they have that correlation, they can turn that into a profile and use that to make predictions, right? They predict that other people who purchase furniture anti-scuff pads will also pay off their credit cards. The past predicts the future. And so they can use that correlation to make predictions, and these are actionable predictions, predictions that they act on. They will now market the credit cards to the people who buy furniture anti-scuff pads. They act on the prediction. So Eric Siegel, in his book Predictive Analytics, defines predictive analytics as technology that learns from past experience, data, to predict the future behavior of individuals in order to drive better decisions. So I think that's a nice, concise definition. And we see this with the credit card default risk analysis here. They have what's called a target variable. That's the thing you want to predict. They want to predict people paying off their credit cards, people being a good credit risk, right? Then they look at this massive data set that includes the target variable. It includes people who were good credit risk and people who were not. And they look for correlations to the target variable that they're trying to predict. They create a profile, purchase of furniture anti-scuff pads. They apply that profile to future potential customers to select who they are going to market the cards to. That's an actionable prediction. When people ask me kind of, to describe what big data analytics, predictive analytics is, I say kind of the closest analogy that we have in our in our culture is the idea of the crystal ball, right? That allows you to look into it and see the future, predict the future. And that's what predictive analytics, big data analytics enables companies and others who use it to do. And it's a very powerful tool. It can predict with not certainty, but with great accuracy, predict many things. And just as in mythology, the crystal ball, is awesome in the sense that it has awesome power. That power can be used for great good, or that power can be used for evil. And I think the same is true of predictive analytics. So there are many benefits to predictive analytics, and we see them the way it is used in the economy. Marketing, for example, marketing of credit cards to people who are likely to pay them off. Medicine, predicting what medicines will work for particular individuals based on a correlation, based on what medicines have worked for individuals that have similar attributes in the past. Education, what educational strategies will work best for particular students. This is all about personalization, predicting what will be best for this individual based on past experience. Human resources, who will be best for this job? Who should get the promotion? Finance, who's going to be a good credit risk? To whom should I give the loan? Insurance, what's somebody's insurance risk? How much should I charge them? All of these are ways that predictive analytics is being used in the economy today, and so these are all benefits, economic benefits that this technology brings. And this just scratches the surface. There are many other such areas. But there are also risks associated with commercial use of big data analytics, and I identify them in three main areas: privacy, manipulation, and bias. So let me start with privacy. And forgive me if some of you have heard this story before. It's been told quite a number of times, but I think it's a very good illustration. First of all, do you have Target in Brazil? No? Oh, okay. Target, for those of you who don't know, is like the big retail store. They actually have kind of nice clothing there for such a big store. Target is one for us. Walmart is the other. Walmart it is not quite as don't have quite as nice things. And my wife told me actually that her sister, because of this, refers to Target as Target. So, but anyway, Target was and its competitors all knew that if you make purchases at their store at critical moments, life-changing moments, then you will continue to come back to their store. As shoppers, we are very habitual. Once we start to go one place, we'll keep going there for other things. So they try to market to people at moments of critical life changes, right? Moments of, of passage where something really important is happening in your life, including when someone gives birth to a child. So Target and its competitors would track the registry of live births, right, which is published, and they would send baby-related advertisements to the women who had given birth. Well, Target wanted to do better. They wanted to reach these women when they were pregnant, before they gave birth, okay? But to do that, they needed to be able to predict which women were going to give birth, which women were pregnant. And they used big data analytics to do this. And they thought, if we can do this, then, they will come to us. We'll market this, our baby goods, to them. They'll come to us for this, and then we have them, until the next major life event, right? And they'll be our shoppers. So what they did is they looked at their female customers and what they had purchased in the past, and they knew that some of these women had given birth, right? Because they were reflected in the registry of live births, and also at Target. In the States, if you're having a baby, people have a baby shower. People will bring them baby-related gifts. So you can register at Target, kind of like you register for your wedding, you can register at Target for your baby shower. So they knew that some of their customers also had given birth because they registered for a baby shower. So the target variable, women who were pregnant, was in their data set, and they knew it, right, from the past. So they looked for correlations. What did women who were pregnant tend to buy that women who were not pregnant did not buy, right? Because if they can find those correlating purchases, then they can turn that into a profile, look at current women buying things at Target or at other stores, because they can get this data, broad sets of data, and they can use that profile to predict who is pregnant, right? And then they can market baby goods to them while they're pregnant instead of waiting till after they give birth. So they came up with a list of about 25 items, some of which, we can kind of understand, others of which are less intuitive, but things like unscented baby lotion, zinc supplements, large pocketbooks that maybe you could hold diapers and things in, hand sanitizers, washcloths, cotton balls, and blue rugs. Maybe that's for women who are preparing to give birth to a boy. I don't know. But again, they didn't need to know why. They don't need, in big data analytics, you don't need to understand causality. You only need to understand correlation. And these items, these 25 items, correlated very closely to women being pregnant. And so they then turned that pattern into a profile, and they looked for women who had purchased many of these things, and they inferred from that they were pregnant and predicted that they would give birth, and sent them lots of coupons for baby goods, right, to market to them so they could capture them at this critical life moment. So, as reported in the New York Times, a father one day storms into his local Target store with a fistful of these baby coupons, demands to speak to the manager. And he says, what the hell are you doing sending these baby coupons to my 15-year-old daughter? Are you trying to get her to think about getting pregnant? What is your problem? And the manager apologized. I'm so sorry, sir. There must have been some terrible mistake, etc. Guy goes home. The next day, the manager calls him to apologize again. And the father said, "It is I who owe you an apology. I had a conversation with my daughter. It turns out she is pregnant." So Target knew more about this girl's pregnancy than her father did. Now, regardless of what we may think about when a 15-year-old should or should not tell her father that she's pregnant, and we don't know the situation in that family, right? But this girl had chosen to keep that private and Target inadvertently, through predictive analytics, revealed this very private information. And studies have shown that simply through Facebook likes, right, and your Facebook community, just that data, researchers can predict political affiliation, sexual orientation, mental health, lots of things that pregnancy status, lots of things that we would consider to be very private. And so predictive analytics allows companies to infer this information with a high degree of accuracy. And then we kind of are at their mercy not to reveal it, right? And Target did this unintentionally, but it did it nonetheless. So that's the first risk from predictive analytics. Commercial use of predictive analytics is a whole new and very invasive type of privacy risk. A second is manipulation. And I think the best example of this, or the one that most of us have heard about, is the Facebook Cambridge Analytica episode. What most people talk about with respect to this is what Facebook did, which is to say, allowing a researcher to get access to the Facebook likes information of about 87 million users who were not aware that this was being conveyed. So that's on the Facebook side. But let's think about what Cambridge Analytica did with this data once they got it. The researcher who Facebook had initially allowed to access this information had initiated an online, a Facebook survey. So he invited Facebook users to take a survey that would show their personality type. It's a very well-known type of survey that shows your personality type with great accuracy. And it shows whether you're an open person or a neurotic person or a fearful person, conscientious person. It shows there's like 6 different personality types it shows. So he got about 250,000 Facebook users to take this survey and also to give him access to their likes, okay? The way Facebook operated at the time, it does not, the rules have changed now, but at the time, if you get someone, a Facebook user, to give you their Facebook information, their likes and other profile data, you can also get the information that their friends have shared with them, right? So when you share something with a friend, that friend can also share it with a third party. And that's how, from these 250,000 Facebook users, they had 87 million friends. And so this researcher got the likes, Facebook likes data on these additional 87 million people under Facebook's rules at the time. He sold all of this to Cambridge Analytica. So what did they do? They looked for patterns. They looked for correlations. They knew in the 250,000, they knew the personality types of those people because they'd taken the test, right? And they said, okay, what types of things does an open person like on Facebook? What about a neurotic person, a fearful person, a conscientious person? They figured out the correlation. They turned that correlation into a profile and applied it to the 87 million who had not taken the test. And they were able to infer their personality types. And then Cambridge Analytica, which was employed at the time by the Trump campaign, sent targeted political messages to these 87 million that were designed to appeal unconsciously to their personality type and be very hard for them to resist. That, I think, what was so disturbing to people about this, in addition to the personal data of the 87 million being shared, was what Cambridge Analytica did with it, used it to target these highly manipulative political advertisements. You know, nobody has, it's unclear whether it affected the election or not, but I think the idea that we are going to be appealed to unconsciously through this powerful technology in a way that could shape our vote really offended people, really upset people. So this risk of, when you can infer things about people, you can infer their vulnerabilities, and then you can take advantage of them. Maybe infer somebody who is in the early stages of dementia and doesn't know it yet, but the data scientist knows it, and they could be targeted with, you know, unfavorable loans or other types of things that would take advantage of them. We can think of quite a number of areas. If you can infer somebody's vulnerabilities, you can take advantage of them and manipulate them. So that's the second main risk. The third is bias, and this can be of two types. In the States, we distinguish between kind of intentional bias and disparate impact. So where it's not intentional, but it emerges from the way the system operates. So you could use this technology for intentional bias. Let's say the company using the pregnancy prediction algorithm was not Target. It was some other company using the same insight to evaluate their female job applicants. And they could infer whether these women were pregnant, and then perhaps decide not to interview the women who were pregnant, right? Because in their minds, at least, maybe that was going to end up being more costly for them, et cetera. In the States, you cannot ask somebody, it's illegal to ask somebody in an interview if they're pregnant or to discriminate against them on that basis. But here, they wouldn't have to ask. They could infer it, and it would still be illegal in the States, but it would be very hard to detect, okay? But that would be intentional discrimination against a protected class, in this case, pregnant women. But it can also be unintentional and a disparate impact, and Amazon provides a very good example of this. Also, in terms of discrimination against women, Amazon gets tens of thousands of resumes each year. And so they decided to develop an artificial intelligence tool to sort through the resumes and help them decide whether these are people they should review more closely or not. And what they did is they had the resumes of the people they'd already hired. They knew from that the attributes of people that they liked, that they had hired. So they trained the tool on the resumes of the people that they had hired, and it found the patterns. What are things in the resumes, you know, that are associated with people that that Amazon hired? I would imagine they also gave them resumes of people they hadn't hired. You know, what distinguishes the people they'd hired from the people they didn't? Well, there's a well-known bias in the technology industry in favor of men, right? It's been documented. And so most Amazon employees were men. And so this tool learned to discriminate against women because resumes that had been rejected had things that identified them as female, like going to an all-women's college or playing on a women's volleyball team. It was putting those resumes to the side, right? Not because anybody intended that, but that was the pattern. The training data was shaped by the bias. And so the bias then gets perpetuated and kind of baked in to the algorithm that is trained on that bias data. So that's how bias can get into data analytics without intention. If the data from which it is learning is itself a product of bias, like the data on Amazon employees was a product of bias against women in favor of men. So Amazon spotted this problem, and they did not fully implement this tool, okay? But it still appeared in the newspapers, et cetera. But I think it's a very good example of bias. So we have three types of risks, main types of risks here: privacy, manipulation, and bias. It is my contention that privacy and data protection law do not protect people from these risks. And to explain it, I want to talk a little bit about privacy and data protection law. Does anybody know who this man is? He's really shaped this field. Okay, this is Alan Weston, the author of an important 1967 book called Privacy and Freedom. I couldn't find a picture of him from the 1960s, but this one is from the 1970s, and I like it because of like the sideburns and the big glasses. You know, it's like a very 70s kind of look. But he wrote this very important book, Privacy and Freedom. And Weston said, look, people don't want to be completely opaque and cut off from others, right? That'd be like being on a desert island. And that would be a form of torture. It's like solitary confinement. But people also don't want to be completely transparent and have everything seen by others, right? That would be another form of torture. What people want is something in between, complete opacity and complete transparency. They want a balance. And different people draw that balance differently. Some are more willing to share things about themselves. Some are less willing. They're more private, right? And so what we need to do is let people choose that balance. Give them the control to choose that balance. And so he says that's what privacy is. Privacy is the ability to control the disclosure of your personal information. It's not being completely hidden from everybody, right? That would be torture. But it's the ability to control what you share. So this is from a quote from his book. He says, "For this is the core of the right to individual privacy, the right of the individual to decide for himself when and on what terms his acts should be revealed to the general public." And you can see this definition of privacy repeated, many scholarly articles, many statutes. This is the vision of privacy that is at the core of the Fair Information Practices, the OECD, FIPS, the 1995 Data Protection Directive, the GDPR, US privacy statutes, and I would submit the LGPD as well. What privacy and data protection laws seek to do is give people this control, and so give them privacy, because what is privacy? It's control over your personal information. It's the ability to choose for yourself that balance. It's not secrecy. And some people sometimes confuse privacy with secrecy, but those concepts are really distinct. And so we get mechanisms in privacy law designed to give people this control, especially notice, consent, and purpose limitation, right? You have to be notified before your data is collected and of the purposes for which the data processor or controller will use your data. You get an opportunity to consent or not to consent to that. And then the data controller is limited, the data processor is limited to using the data only for the purposes that they stated in the notice and that you agreed to in your consent. Right? Is this familiar? I mean, this is the essence of the OECD FIPS. This is at the heart of US privacy law. This is EU data protection law, et cetera, these core requirements. The problem is that this control paradigm of privacy law assumes that the processor knows the purpose of the processing at the time of collection, because that would allow them to give people notice of the purpose of the processing at the time of collection, and so allow people to make a choice, and so allow purpose limitation, which limits them to the purpose that they stated in the notice. But frequently, for big data analytics, this is not true. I mean, consider the furniture anti-scuff pads, right? At the time that data was collected, they had no idea that this was going to be the thing that predicted, predicted good credit risk. And what data analytics is all about is finding unanticipated correlations. And so repurposing data for secondary uses based on these insights from the unanticipated correlations. And that interferes with notice, because if you don't know the purpose at the time of collection, you don't figure that out until later when you analyze the data and develop your pattern and your profile, then you can't provide notice of that purpose at the moment of collection. And if you can't provide notice of the purpose, then people cannot meaningfully consent, and then you cannot have a purpose limitation because there was no purpose provided at the time of the notice, unless you do a very general purpose, like we're going to use this data to get insights about you. That's not the kind of specific notice that data protection law requires. The other reason why privacy and data protection law are not sufficient to protect people in the algorithmic economy is that the threats, as we've seen, go beyond privacy. They include bias, they include manipulation, and other threats. But these are the main ones. So I think what we really need today is two systems of regulation. We need a system of regulation for standard data processing where the company knows the purpose, right? It's collecting your data for a certain purpose. It knows what it is at that time, and it can tell you what it is, right? You know, we want to know your location data so we can market things to you that are in the area where you're working, and you can choose, yes, I'm going to share my location data or not. You know what the purpose is, you know what you're agreeing to, you can make an effective choice, right? And I think traditional privacy and data protection law, the GDPR, et cetera, work for this type of standard situation, but we're living in a new world now. A new world of the algorithmic economy, of big data analytics, in which often the companies do not know the purpose at the time of collection because they're going to repurpose the data once they get insights into it. And so for this, the control paradigm cannot work to protect people. And so we need another form of regulation to protect people. I think that new paradigm has to have two key features. Number one, it cannot depend on individual choice and control. There's got to be some level of social protection. There needs to be a regulator who will draw substantive lines, who will make value choices as to what's appropriate and what's not. Previously, regulators in the privacy area have focused on ensuring that there is adequate notice and consent and that companies stick with their purpose limitation and data minimization, other core aspects of data protection law. But they've assumed that as long as people get notice and consent to it, then the processing is legitimate. I mean, the individual decided it was okay, right? So who am I as a regulator to substitute my view for the individual's? That would be paternalistic. So we're going to just rely on notice and consent, let the individual decide. Well, I would say, you know, you don't do people any favors by giving them choices where they cannot meaningfully make a choice. And it's not paternalistic to set standards then. It's protective. You know, where people cannot protect themselves, then society needs to step in and protect them. I mean, we see this in areas like food and drug law, right? I don't assess every drug that I take and read all the studies, you know, to assess whether it's safe or not. I'm not capable of making that choice. I depend on a regulator that has expertise to make some judgments, what's safe and what's not. And I depend on that, right? I think we need something similar with predictive analytics, where we cannot understand what can be predicted from our data, what can be inferred, and the companies, even if they wanted to, couldn't really give us good notice in any event. So I think, you know, what has happened is, since we've been so focused on control, since Allen Weston, the control paradigm, we assume that if notice is given and if there's consent, then whatever the processing is, it's legitimate, and we don't have to engage in the hard value discussions as to what is appropriate and what's not in our society. And I think it's time to engage in those hard questions. Relying on notice and consent is not sufficient anymore. So this is the first quality I think the new regulatory paradigm has to have, which is social protection rather than individual control as a focus. Has to be a regulator making substantive value choices about what's okay to do with predictive analytics and what's not okay. And manipulation is not okay, privacy invasion is not okay, bias is not okay. There may be other things. Somebody's got to be making those public choices. And secondly, this type of regulation has to be capable not only of addressing privacy risks, but also risks of manipulation and risks of bias. So those are the two key features that have to be present. We see models of this already today in regulation and in scholarship. And since, do you think it's okay if I go a little past the hour and we have maybe 20 minutes for the?
Feel free.
Okay. So one of the things we see in regulation is legitimate interests, right? We've heard about this quite a bit at this conference already. And this is built into data protection law and built into the LGPD in those situations where it's not possible to get consent. And arguably, this is one of those situations. If you can't give somebody notice of the purpose, then it's not possible to get their advance consent at the time of collection, and legitimate interest, perhaps, is the better legal basis. And in fact, legitimate interest, requires the controller to weigh its legitimate interests against the data subject's fundamental rights and freedoms to make a value choice as to whether this is okay or not. Now, in the first instance, it's the controller making this choice. I would rather have a public regulator making the choice, right? The controller, has a certain a certain way they want this analysis to come out that could flavor how they do the analysis. But of course, their judgments can be checked by a regulator if there's sufficient monitoring. But the key thing I want to point out is this does draw substantive values-based lines as to what's okay and what's not. It doesn't just rely on consent and control. It's a movement beyond the control paradigm already in data protection law. And so this resolves, for data protection law, the legal basis issue, where you can't get consent. I will say that it does not address the issue of purpose limitation, right? Even if you do a legitimate interest balancing for the legal basis, you still have to comply with the principles, which include purpose limitation. And so if the processor cannot identify the purpose at the time of collection, then you can't articulate, let me take that back. If the processor is always looking for unanticipated correlations and secondary uses to repurpose the data, they will not be able to comply with a specific purpose limitation. And so I think there's a real problem about the way purpose limitation fits with big data analytics, and have question as to whether big data analytics can fully be used in where specific purpose limitation is required. There are some limited exceptions to purpose limitation, but they don't cover a lot of the ways that predictive analytics is used today. Important scholarship in the privacy field also tries to figure out ways to draw new substantive standards. Two of the most influential privacy law scholars in the last decade or so, in the US at least, have been Jack Balkin from Yale and Helen Nissenbaum, who's now at Cornell. And Balkin has this very influential idea of information fiduciaries, the idea being that tech companies that hold a lot of our data, we are trusting them with our data. And they have a lot of power over us. And so they're kind of like lawyers or doctors that we trust with our data, and we depend on them to keep it confidential. And so the law has addressed that for lawyers and doctors and said they have fiduciary duties. I don't know if you have the same concept in Brazilian law. But they have to obey a duty of care. They have to take reasonable care of their clients. And a duty of loyalty. They have to put their clients' interests first before their own. And he argues that we should have similar duties of care and loyalty applied to information fiduciaries. Those are substantive values, right? Duty of care, duty of loyalty. This is not about control. This is not about giving the individual a choice. This is about, these companies that hold a lot of individual data. He focuses on social media platforms like Facebook and others need to behave as fiduciaries of that data and trustees of that data and act in a way that is trustworthy or they violate the law. In an article that I recently published, I have a criticism of Balkan's position vis-a-vis data analytics, but in the interest of time, I'm going to save that for the Q&A. If people are interested, I can address it there. Helen Nissenbaum has this very famous idea of contextual integrity, which she first stated in her book, Privacy in Context, and more recently in a book chapter called Big Data's End Run Around Consent. She applies this to big data analytics. And she argues that data processors should have to comply with the informational norms that govern their context. Like if you share information with your doctor, again, you expect that to be kept very private, right? There are norms in particular contexts that go beyond individual choice. These are social norms. So again, she is finding a way to create some substantive values, norms, to govern disclosure and use of data based on the social context. And I also have a critique of her idea as applied to big data analytics, and I'm happy to come back to that as well. But the main thing I wanted to bring out is that this very influential body of scholarship also is looking for substantive values, drawing lines as to what is appropriate and what's not. If it's consistent with the informational social norms, it's appropriate. If it's not consistent, generally it's not appropriate. She does have to acknowledge that that can't be the only rule, because if that were the only rule, technology could not evolve, right? Like, we would be stuck with the technologies that we are comfortable with and that our social norms accept today. Nothing else could ever be implemented, right? At the time Brandeis, right, wrote his famous Right to Privacy article with Brandeis and Warren back in 1890, what was upsetting them was what was called the snap camera, right? You could take an instant photo of people. This was very upsetting to people back then. If we'd enforced those social norms and kept them, and not let anything that violated those social norms, those informational norms, then you would need to, we wouldn't be able to have snap cameras or many other technologies. So this limits her view, and she says, she acknowledges that we need to allow some norm-breaking technologies, and her test for that, when it's okay to break the norms, is when the technologies are more effective in promoting interests, general moral and political values, and context-specific ends, purposes, and values, such as fairness, justice, freedom, autonomy, welfare, and others more specific to the context in question. So when is it okay to depart from informational norms? When doing so more effectively promotes, fairness, justice, freedom, autonomy, welfare, and other context-specific values. And now I'm going to give you my critique. That's a very, very vague test. I mean, would you like to try to apply that test? Each of these concepts, fairness, justice, freedom, autonomy, are contested. So, this is where I think, given that many big data technologies are going to break informational norms, we don't anticipate them, she has to get to this part of her analysis. We can't rely on the informational norms for setting the substantive standards. We need to go beyond that to this other kind of what I call stage 2 of contextual integrity, and that's a very vague and imprecise test. Okay. So let me suggest another idea, and this is what I've been working on. And the way I arrived at this is I just thought, look, what are we trying to do? We're trying to draw lines between what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, between what is fair and what's unfair. Well, we have a whole body of law devoted to this. It's called Unfair Business Practices Law. And it authorizes a regulator to draw lines between business practices that are fair and those that are unfair. And I don't see why that couldn't be applied to big data analytics business practices. Many nations already have such a law. Brazil has a consumer protection law that I have not had a chance to study in depth, but my understanding is it contains very similar concepts of this. The United States has the Federal Trade Commission Act, Section 5, which I have studied in depth. And Federal Trade Commission Act, Section 5 says, the Commission is hereby empowered and directed to prevent businesses from using unfair methods of competition and from using unfair or deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce. Just raise your hand if you've heard about, deceptiveness actions by the FTC under Section 5, going after companies that have been deceptive. Some people heard of a few? Okay. This is what the FTC has primarily been known for and how it became the leading privacy regulator in the United States, okay? But they haven't focused on the second part of this power, which is their unfairness authority. Not deceptiveness is when a company promises to do one thing, like in their privacy policy, and then they don't, right? They act deceptively. And that undermines individual choice because people relied on the privacy policy. So deceptiveness is very tied to choice and so to the control paradigm and notice. Unfairness is different. Unfairness draws substantive lines. The regulator draws substantive lines between what's fair and what's unfair. It's not about individual choice. It's not about notice the way deceptiveness is. And the Fair Trade Commission Act, Federal Trade Commission Act, defines unfairness as those situations in which business action causes substantial injury to individuals that is not reasonably avoidable by those people. Think about that. It's exactly in those situations where people cannot make a choice, cannot effectively protect themselves, that unfairness kicks in. That's where deceptiveness gives way to unfairness. This is how I understand the two parts of the FTC's authority. And is not outweighed, the injuries are not outweighed by countervailing benefits. So you have a kind of a cost-benefit balancing approach, not unlike legitimate interests in this test, and which I also think is appropriate for big data analytics because, yes, it poses risks, but it also creates tremendous benefits. And so we don't want to ban big data analytics, right? It can bring many beneficial things. We want to limit its abuses, right? And so balancing the costs and benefits to see what's allowed seems appropriate to me. And it also says, in making these judgments, you should look to the values expressed in established public policies. To me, that's a much clearer guide than Nissenbaum's, look to freedom and autonomy and justice and, these broad philosophical ideas. No, look at what your legislators have expressed in legislation, the values. Let that be your guide. To me, that's more politically legitimate in a democracy to look in those ways. Does this work? Could this work for advanced analytics? I think it could. Is there injury? Yes. If you're denied insurance or a job, big data eligibility determinations or a loan, there's real injury there. Is it not avoidable by the individual themselves? Yes, that's what we just talked about before, that people can't understand what can be learned from their data, cannot understand what can be inferred, and they can't even be presented with the purpose at the time of collection, so they can't make that choice. So it's not avoidable by the individual, and we can't put the burden on the individual to protect themselves. We need social protection. We need a regulator to decide what's fair and what's unfair. Do the injuries outweigh the benefits? That depends on the analysis, but that's the right question to be asking. That's the question that, as society, we need to ask about big data analytics. You know, what are the risks? And are those risks outweighed by the benefits? And we need somebody representing the public to do that. We can't put that burden on the individual. So I would say that it includes the two key components that I mentioned. Regulator sets the standard. It authorizes the Federal Trade Commission to do that. And it is fully capable of addressing not only privacy, which could be unfair, but risks of manipulation, risks of bias, also unfair. And so it's broad enough to encompass all the risks. How should the regulator draw these lines? Well, that's really the difficult question here, right? How do you decide whether the costs outweigh the benefits, for example? How do you decide what counts as injury for these purposes? So in administrative law, in the states at least, there's kind of two main ways that regulators can set standards or rules. One is by issuing rules, publishing written rules. The other is what we call adjudicatory policymaking, that is, bringing enforcement actions and setting policy through their enforcement actions, almost a common law method of creating precedents based on the enforcement actions that they do. And that's what the FTC tends to do, is bring enforcement actions, and from that, you know, it fleshes out how it interprets its policy. So adjudicatory policymaking is kind of more workable, where you don't really understand like the situation that the regulator finds herself in this situation is that the regulator doesn't know what all the different business practices are, and so is not in a position to proactively create a rule that defines what's fair and what's unfair, right? It's more workable for them to create policy through adjudication on a case-by-case business and build a set of rules over time with these precedents. But that's the upside of adjudicatory policymaking here. The downside is that it creates uncertainty for companies because they don't know exactly what's expected of them, right? They would prefer a rule that tells them this is what you need to do. So rules have more certainty, but it's very difficult for a regulator to write good rules when they lack the information about the industry, right? And frankly, it's not good for business either, because if you get a bad rule that doesn't understand what your business model is and what you need to do, you know, that can be a major problem as well. There's an analogous problem in data protection law in Europe. And I had the opportunity to study a version of this problem in the Netherlands. So Dutch data protection law, like many other data protection laws, have some serious ambiguities. Like, you can only process the data for purposes that are not incompatible with the initial purpose. Well, what's compatible and what's incompatible, right? That's very vague and very hard for companies to predict whether a given use is or is not compatible. And in the Netherlands, the Data Protection Authority does not issue regulations. They didn't issue rules that spelled out for a given industry what's compatible and what's not, in part because they don't have all the knowledge about that industry. Same situation we've got with, you know, fairness for big data analytics. So the Dutch used a code of conduct approach to this. The regulator said to industry sectors, look, you develop a code of conduct that explains how the broad law applies to your industry, like what are compatible uses and what are not, okay? And then you share that code with us, we'll review it, we'll raise objections, we'll negotiate it with you, right, until we reach a text that we can both agree with. And what you get here is the regulator representing the public values, industry providing the industry knowledge, right, and come together in this code of conduct. And if the regulator then approves the code, then compliance with the code is equal to compliance with the law. It creates a legal safe harbor. people refer to this as a form of contractual regulation, like negotiated rules between the regulator and the regulated. So I spent 6 months in the Netherlands, had a Fulbright professorship, and I was interviewing people who were involved in negotiating these codes and studying these codes. And I found that, they have both strengths and weaknesses. Strengths, there's a lot of information flows from industry to the regulators, right? Especially when they trust that the regulators are not going to use it against them, but are going to use it to try and craft a workable rule. So the regulators get more knowledge about the industry that allows them to, with the industry, create a code that is tailored to the true realities of that industry and is workable for that industry. Members of that sector, companies in that sector, take ownership of the code. They're like, this is not just a law that came down that somebody said, you do this. We created this code. This is our code. And so they are more willing to embrace it and, and they resist it less. There are also some downsides. I spoke to a former Dutch Data Protection Authority official, and he said, look, when we come into these negotiations, whoever holds the pen has more power, right? They do the initial draft. And here it's industry that does the initial draft, and so we're in a weaker position. So that's something to be aware of. Do these codes tend to be more lenient to industry than they should be? Maybe one potential cure from that is to add an element of public participation to this, civil society. The codes can be anti-competitive because who comes together to draft the code? It's the established companies in a given industry, right? And so they may write the rules in a way that they can comply with, but it's going to be harder for new entrants and startups to comply with. And so you have to be aware when you have a group of established companies coming together to draft rules that they don't do so in an anti-competitive way. And a lack of monitoring. I spoke to the representative from the banking industry who wrote their code, and I said, so are the companies, in your industry complying with this code? He said, we don't know. Like they don't have a system set up for monitoring and checking. So the regulator has to provide that role. Perhaps we could have sectoral codes that specify what fairness is for the use of big data analytics in particular sectors. Use something like the Dutch model. If a country is going to do that, they need to be aware, of course, of both the strengths and the weaknesses of the code of conduct approach. But I'll kind of go out on a limb, acknowledging those weaknesses. I'll still go out on a limb and make a proposal for this new paradigm of regulation, not to replace data protection law, but to operate alongside it, that will use unfair business practices laws to set substantive limits on what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, what's fair, what's not fair. Unfair business practices laws as interpreted through approved industry sector codes of conduct. Now, in my final minutes, I want to turn briefly to the LGPD. And I see some aspects of that law that relate to and could be the basis for a regulatory paradigm of this type. I acknowledge that there is consumer protection law in Brazil, and maybe that's the basis for doing this, as I have argued it should be in the US, but you guys also have the LGPD, right? So what does that law provide here? It creates some opportunities for a regulator to set substantive standards. Legitimate interest balancing is one aspect of that. This very interesting reference to good faith in Article 6, what exactly does that mean? Is it kind of similar to the concept of fairness? We've had some interesting discussions over the last couple of days about this. That's a very interesting area to explore. I read a report by the Internet Lab about the statute, and they said that in an original version of the law, the language was fair and in good faith. So maybe there is a fairness dimension to this. Another very interesting provision on, regulated parties should comply with good practice and governance, including considering all the risks and benefits, right? So regulators could set standards there. What does it mean to consider the risk? What risks? How do you weigh them against the benefits? This is kind of similar, again, to the Section 5 test. And they have to institute mechanisms for risk mitigation. The LGPD expressly goes beyond privacy. This is a very interesting provision, the non-discrimination principle in Article 6. That's unusual in data protection laws. I had not seen it before in other laws. And so this statute already is going beyond privacy to address bias. I think there's some really interesting potential there. And the LGPD acknowledges a potential role for sectoral codes of conduct. It says, associations can formulate rules for good practice and governance, and the national authority can recognize those rules. Now, does that mean that there will be negotiated with the national authority? Does it mean that if it recognizes the rules, that creates a legal safe harbor for the purposes of the statute? All that is unclear. But again, I'm looking for areas in the statute that relate to the new paradigm that I think we need to go alongside data protection law. And I think there are elements of this in the Brazilian statute. Of course, if you are going to use codes of conduct or something of that nature, bear in mind the strengths and the weaknesses of this approach. But I think there's potential to find the elements of the new paradigm in Brazilian data protection law. And especially, I don't want to end this talk without mentioning, this provision in the Brazilian law, stating that the purpose is to protect the fundamental rights of freedom of privacy and the free development of the personality of the natural person. I love this language. This is beautiful language in a statute because to me, that's really what privacy is all about, right? Giving people the freedom to develop fully and authentically their personality, who they want and need to be as a person. And so, that's substantive. It's not about just control. That's about creating a society in which people can freely and fully develop themselves. And that's not Alan Weston. That's Louis Brandeis. And if you go back to his 1890 article that he wrote with Warren, this is what he's talking about, the inviolable personality and the right to develop and experience your inviolable personality. And so I love this language in the Brazilian data protection law. I think it does relate to this idea of setting some substantive values that will protect people and will allow them, freely to develop their personality. So again, I congratulate you on your new law and wish you much luck as you continue to understand and implement it.
Thank you, Professor. I'm sure that you're all astounded by the presentation. Excellent presentation, so many details, quite clear approach to the most important challenges of big data, even changing contextually the approach of data protection and make us think about the feasibility of using some classical instruments in the work of protection to privacy and data protection and bring the new paradigm of algorithms. I personally was quite impressed and pleased and even thankful for all the work you had, Professor, in checking the last developments of the LGPD and make the connection of Article 1st of LGPD that I should tell you, very few people will read it. And it is indeed quite important. It is the support of the law. The idea of developing privacy in Brazilian law is to really give support to the free development of personality in the environment of data processing and data handling. And I believe this can provide basis for personal control when due, but also different forms of control in different groups, so many instruments that have to be used together with the personal protection, but following the same order of values. So I think it's quite interesting when you made the link between the Brandeis and Violet personality. Just out of curiosity, it makes me think that since the very beginning of the conceptualization of modern privacy, the idea of protecting personality as an essential human value was present, and that has been developed for many, many years. And amongst the examples that Professor gave us, one is quite relevant, and I'm going to use this for the question I have. He gave the example of Tesco that is quite known. And I think that it's very interesting to compare to the example of another supermarket. I'm sorry, your example was a Target, and I wanted to give the example of Tesco, that is a UK supermarket. What happened in UK in Tesco? It was almost a naive way of Target, but they used the same big data tools to find out what consumers found out and why, brought and why. But the result was a little different. In Tesco, there was a Friday after work, and some consumers came to Tesco and they found this new promotion. If you buy diapers, you can take a 6-pack of beers with a discount. What was the rationale of big data analytics behind that? Is that, new fathers, generally, they would go to the pub before the babies. So after the babies, they wouldn't go to the pub, so they would buy beer to drink at home. And so what's the correlation I want to try to do? Well, probably it's a poor correlation, but for the purpose of discussion, it's okay. Big data tools are available both to Target and to Tesco, but maybe in the European Union, and I don't know if this is what happened, but perhaps the application of such an intrusive technique with even dramatic effects for the family, for privacy, maybe was not possible. Maybe clients wouldn't like that. It maybe would lead to a regulatory response. So what I wanted to try to ask, or maybe just for food for thought, the change of paradigm that you talked about, suggesting that we use the principle of fairness to approach big data problems is quite interesting. But I wonder if when the European data protection law was conceived, they didn't think of that beforehand. Even in the 70s, we had the first commissioner of data protection in the world, and he said that data protection does not lie, the problem does not lie in the personal control, but in the control of massive data that would be even greater in the future. And perhaps because of that, European law since the 70s have resorted to the right to appeal to automated decisions, not to be subject to merely automated decisions, and the mere fact that in European law, countries have to have an authority of data protection, I think is sign that authorities are much better positioned to have collective control over practices to benefit not only the individual, not to support the individual, but also to deny practices that can hurt consumers as a mass. My opinion is, do you think the European Union has traditionally paid more attention to these issues than other geographies? And my second point, Professor, do you think the instruments that GDPR developed, and many of them are in LGPD, could somehow fight the problems that are related to big data that you raised? And remember, in LGPD, we not only have LGPD in what we receive from GPR, but also from other agencies like the Consumer Protection Law and even the principle of good faith that is part of our civil code. And it is a very valid clause. Today, it is something that we discuss in court. LGPD, well, not all of it. Maybe you're going to have good surprises, but it is unexpected in court. But good faith is expected. So I would appreciate if you could say something about that. And after you answer, we go to the questions of the audience.
A couple of questions. First of all, my interpretation of the Tesco approach, and if you buy the diapers, you get beer. I have a different interpretation of that, which is, having been a new father with a new baby at home, you're just going to be stressed out. You're going to need a beer at the end of the day. So, and it brings to mind, how do we draw these lines? What kind of targeting is okay and what's not okay? I mean, personally, if for whatever reason, new parents tend to drink more beer and the data analytics shows that, I don't see any harm, really, in targeting them with an ad or a promotion for that, right? It may be something they want. On the other hand, if you use data analytics based on social media data and other kind of data exhausts that we give out to infer who is an alcoholic or who has the potential to be an alcoholic, and you start marketing alcohol to them because you know that they can't resist it and they're going to buy a lot of it and it's going to do harm to them, I would say that's unfair. Like that crosses the line. So again, I think we need to find ways of drawing that line. It's not like everything is bad, but it's also not like we can just rely on the individual to protect themselves. We need to have a standard for drawing that, whether it's good faith, whether it's unfairness, whether it's contextual integrity, whether it's fiduciary duties, whether it's legitimate interest. We need some way to do that. Yes, I think data protection law started with ideas of fairness. And it is in the GDPR, for example, fair and lawful. It is, important early language in that regulation. But I think the way GDPR gets written and gets implemented, it becomes much more about the control. It's lots on consent and purpose specification and, what's voluntary choice, what's not. It really, as implemented, is much more utilizing. There are other things. There are data protection impact assessments. there's privacy by design, there's other dimensions that go beyond the control paradigm, but I still think the control paradigm is front and center and at the heart of GDPR. And this notion of fairness, which people in Europe are starting to discover, there's been writing, how do we, give this word content in the GDPR, has traditionally been uninterpreted, unapplied. It's like a kind of background to the GDPR. The whole GDPR is about achieving fair processing, but fairness itself doesn't have any specific content. Maybe they will give it some, but it hasn't to date. And so I see it as similar in some ways to the US, where we started with Brandeis as the original concept of privacy that really is about the free development of the human personality. But we transitioned to Weston and the control paradigm of privacy. Privacy is about the ability to control your personal data. That's what privacy is, Weston says. As long as you have that control, you have privacy. And that's a very tempting vision, because then we can say, well, the individual chooses, and we don't have to impose standards on people. We don't have to be paternalistic. We can let each individual choose their way. And that is true in some contexts, and was true, I think, for the technologies that existed at the time that Weston was writing, where data was collected for one specific purpose, right? And you know what that purpose is, and you can say yes or no. But today, we get all these unanticipated secondary uses of data. That model doesn't work. So both in the US and in Europe, I think maybe we started with some of these more, free personality ideas, but we kind of migrated to the control model. And I think it's time now to migrate back somewhat. That's why I finished with Brandeis, Can the GDPR, does it have the instruments to fight this? Somewhat, I think. The legitimate interest balancing test could be one way to weigh a number of these different interests. But as I've said, with respect to the LGPD and the GDPR, it's the purpose limitation issue. It's that principle that I see as as kind of, maybe somebody else can explain how, data analytics can be done fully consistent with purpose limitation. But to me, it's inherently about secondary uses and unanticipated purposes. And so I see a real conflict there. I think in some ways, the GDPR and the Europeans have made a choice to have a regulatory system that is not really compatible with big data analytics. That's the way I read it. Maybe it will get interpreted in ways that will open up flexibility and space. I kind of expect that to happen, but I'm not sure, how that happens yet. And I think we see this already, that the GDPR is not able to really deal with these fairness issues. In the last major event that Giovanni Buttarelli, who recently passed away, who was the EDPS supervisor, and he planned the latest international conference of data protection and privacy commissioners. It was all focused on data ethics. He said, we have to do more than what the law requires. We have to behave ethically. We have to define what ethics are in this area. And I think that's very much moving beyond the control paradigm to some kind of substantive standards. This concern with data ethics, I relate to the emergence of advanced analytics and the way that data protection and privacy law in the US don't fully protect people. We need something more. We need some substantive standards. We need some ethics. And I think Buttarelli, was recognizing that as well. So, as important as GDPR is, and I think it's very important and it serves very, useful functions, it doesn't address these issues very well. And these issues, as we move increasingly to an algorithmic economy where big data analytics is woven into so many decisions, these issues become increasingly important.
Thank you so much. We have time for another question.
Digital Commission of the Bar Association in Piauí, a small state here in Brazil. I'm also in a master's program studying digital law in the information society. So I have basically 2 questions. I wrote them down because I tend to forget stuff. So the first one, I want to know what practical solutions do you think that, can you think of to make our law work, our data protection law work? Because what we see is that we already had laws that were protecting our rights, but somehow they didn't work, they weren't enough. So why to create a new legislations for the same stuff? And the other one is about consent. We already know also that people don't read the terms and conditions. We just like scroll down and click agree, so we don't know what we are agreeing on. How can we change this culture of just scrolling down and click accept? Like, I don't know what I'm agreeing on, but I click, I accept. I'm selling my soul, but I accept it. So how can we change this? Thank you.
So, how to effectively implement this law, your first question. And I think it does take regulatory resources. So this idea of having a national authority is critical, right? And understand that there are steps, being taken to address that and to create a national authority. But I think that's obviously, for this statute to be implemented in any kind of a meaningful way, there needs to be a national authority that also has the resources to monitor. And this is what you see in Europe too. They have this wonderful law, but to date, the monitoring and enforcement has been very thin. Now, something that the GDPR adds, and I'm not sure if this is in the LGPD or not, the requirement of a data protection officer. Is that in the LGPD? I think that's really going to help, because now you have somebody inside of these regulated parties whose job it is to look out for this and advocate for this and make sure. So I would say the more you can train and support and inspire those data protection officers, you have an internal person who's working with the company who's aware of these issues, and that helps to bring it into the culture. I think somebody yesterday talked about the importance of creating kind of a culture of privacy, and I think that's very important. Also, insofar as you can make the case, and I don't think it can always be made, but sometimes it can, that behaving responsibly here by companies is not only good for citizens, it's good for business. Facebook has paid a huge price for this Cambridge Analytica issue, right? In their shareholder value, in their public perception, et cetera. So, it is in companies' interest to behave responsibly in this area. So those are just some initial ideas. I do think also this idea that the good faith dimension, I would encourage you to develop that and kind of explore that. That could be a good source of additional kind of practical rules that can make a difference for people. It's true that most of us don't have time, the great majority of us don't have time to read all the notices that we are presented. And so that's another, even without even thinking about big data analytics, that's another limitation on the consent model. I will say that insofar as there can be NGOs and others with knowledge in this area who can read those policies, insofar as there can be regulators who can read those policies, maybe we don't each need to read them. it's important that the companies say them. And I will tell you that, when companies have to draft a privacy policy, one of the things they have to do is figure out what data they have and how they're using it. That alone is an important step. So, support NGOs in this area who can take on that, rather than each of us having to do it, make a small contribution to these organizations that can provide some of that kind of monitoring. And ultimately, when you have a national authority, a regulator who can read these as well. And so I do think the notices can still serve a function, even if, they're not a perfect mechanism, for sure. But I think with the big data analytics, the notices don't address that. Can't solve that because they don't know the purpose at the time of collection.
Well, it's time for coffee break. It should be coffee break now, but due to several questions that we still have, so let's open for one final question. We have a question from Paulo, who, first of all, congratulates you for your brilliant talk and asks, what is supposed to be fair versus unfair control, and even the scholarship vision, isn't that a methodology for bringing ethics? Therefore, wouldn't ethics be the best pathway to address such a dilemma?
So the question is, would ethics be a better pathway than unfairness here? And that's kind of how I see what Helen Nissenbaum is doing. She says, look, social norms are the first standard, but they can't be the only standard, because sometimes technologies that are inconsistent with social norms, that break social norms, are going to be good for humanity. Like, we need to allow some technological innovation. So when should we allow companies to break with social norms? Well, we should allow them to do it when it's ethical, when it's consistent with freedom and autonomy and, all the other things, these broad philosophical visions, ideas that she had. And I think ethics people who talk about ethics, they talk about utilitarian ethics and Aristotelian ethics and virtue ethics, as ideas for kind of how we should structure the rules. I think that has problems on two levels. As good as it sounds, and as much as I might like to live in that world myself, the concepts are very broad, very vague, and subject to interpretation. So, they're not very workable standards in some ways. They might help you to spot some issues, and I think some of these ethical frameworks, AI ethics and things that are floating around, kind of do that. But more importantly, in a democracy, in this area, we need to make value choices as a society. And I think the only way to make legitimate value choices, in a democracy at least, is through our elected representatives. As imperfect as they may be, and all democracies are imperfect, they are still our representatives, and they are the voice of the citizens. And they are the legitimate, when you have a society that has different values and disagreement about values, the way that you solve that is you have an election, and the elected representatives then make the legitimate value choices, and those who didn't win, we accept it this time, and maybe we'll win next time, right? So fairness is a statutory standard set by the legislature, and in the FTC unfairness, I said the kind of interpretive principle that it gives is, in deciding what the costs and the benefits are, look to established public policies, look to the values that the legislatures have expressed. So I would rather have the regulators looking to the values that the legislature has expressed and to existing law, anti-discrimination laws and other laws, than to broad philosophical ethical concepts that are not rooted in our democratic decision making. And that's why, as much as I like this idea of ethics, and in fact I have a whole other study on corporate data ethics and how companies are understanding data ethics and how they're implementing. It's a fascinating area. But I think in making value choices for a society in a democracy, that has to come from our elected representatives, not from a philosopher like Helen Nissenbaum, not from somebody who says they have the answer to what's ethical and what's not. We need to look to the values that our legislature has expressed, and fairness analysis, at least in the US, gets you to do that more. And so to me, it's a more politically legitimate, maybe not as ideal, maybe not as beautiful as the ethics might be, but is a more politically legitimate way to make contested value choices.
Thank you so much, Professor Dennis Hirsch. Now we conclude. Thank you so much for your brilliant talk and Q&A session. Now coffee is being served outside, and please be back in 20 minutes. Thank you.